I'll never forget that moment. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where everything feels manageable until it suddenly isn't. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing contract amendments for the Meridian acquisition, one of the biggest deals Hudson Bay consultants had pursued in years. 5 months of work. 18-hour days. Spreadsheets that made my eyes cross. And then Victor Ashford, our VP of Strategic Partnerships, walked straight toward my cubicle with that particular expression people wear when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in false cheerfulness. "Dina," he said, perching on the edge of my desk in that casual way meant to soften what was coming. "You're phenomenal at what you do." "Really?" "But I'm shuffling the merger prep team." I looked up from my screen. My stomach had already begun its descent before he continued. "You're too detail-focused for the big picture," he said, that smirk spreading across his face like he'd just delivered profound wisdom. "We need people who can think strategically, see the forest instead of the trees." You're the trees, honestly. Great at that, but not what this phase requires. Here's the thing about moments like that, you get maybe 2 seconds to decide how you're going to respond, and that choice echoes forward for months. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. Could feel my jaw tightening. Could sense my team around me trying very hard not to look in our direction while absolutely listening to every word. I took a breath. "I understand," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Who's taking over the contract review?" "Marcus is going to handle the broader strategy side," he said. "And we're bringing in Callum from the Dallas office. Fresh perspective, you know?" Callum. Fresh out of his previous firm, slick presentations, zero experience with regulatory compliance in cross-border acquisitions. I'd already caught 2 material errors in his preliminary work weeks ago, things that could have cost Hudson Bay millions. But I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded and turned back to my monitor as Victor wandered off looking satisfied with himself, probably thinking he'd handled a delicate situation with admirable finesse. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already noticed something peculiar in the legal documentation. A clause buried in subsection 4.7 that seemed designed to shift liability in a way that favored Meridian. Something subtle enough that a casual reader might miss it, but something that would absolutely matter when things inevitably went sideways. I'd flagged it for review but hadn't pushed hard because, well, I was supposedly too detail-focused. Too in the weeds. Not visionary enough. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. I sat there for a while after Victor left, staring at my computer without actually seeing anything. My colleague Simone rolled her chair over, raised an eyebrow in that supportive way that somehow made everything feel both worse and better simultaneously. "That was brutal," she whispered. "That was politics," I replied, which wasn't quite the same thing. I spent the rest of that day transferring my working files to a shared drive, updating my status updates, and doing everything you're supposed to do when you've just been benched from a major project. I went home early, made terrible coffee, and tried not to think about how this would look when the time came for annual reviews. Detail-focused people don't get promoted. They get shuffled into supporting roles and told to be grateful for the opportunity. 2 days passed. 48 hours during which I existed in that strange limbo of still technically working on Hudson Bay projects but fundamentally removed from anything that mattered. I was reassigned to process optimization work, which is corporate speak for go reorganize databases that nobody looks at. Then came Thursday. I was in the middle of mapping data workflows when my phone buzzed. It was Simone. A single message: "Victor is looking for you. He's losing it. Conference room, now." I found him there. Actually, I heard him before I saw him. His voice was coming through the glass walls, raised and sharp in a way I'd never heard before. "Completely unacceptable. Legal has stalled the signing." "Stalled it, Dina. Do you understand what that means? We're bleeding money here. Every day this drags on." I stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind me. Victor was standing near the window, face flushed, gesturing aggressively at Callum, who looked like he'd been catching the tail end of a particularly vicious storm. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice level and calm. Very calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already accepted something and moved past anger into something colder and more useful. Victor spun around. "Why did legal stall the signing? You worked on those contracts. What did you do?" There it was. The moment where everything crystallized. I didn't do anything, I said quietly. What did legal actually say? Callum shifted uncomfortably. They flagged something in the liability clause. Subsection 4.7. They said it needed revision before they could sign off. My heart didn't race. There was no adrenaline spike or sense of vindication. Just a cold, clear awareness that I needed to handle this exactly right. Did they say what the problem was? I asked. They said the wording creates ambiguity around indemnification obligations, Callum mumbled, not meeting my eyes. Which means we could potentially absorb costs that should fall on Meridian's side if litigation ever. How much? Victor interrupted. Legal's estimate? 15 to 50 million, depending on the scenario. The color drained from Victor's face. I watched it happen like I was observing someone else entirely. The smirk was gone. The casual confidence had evaporated. I flagged that issue, I said calmly, on Friday of last week. In my transition summary. Under critical items requiring attention. I even highlighted it in yellow. Victor's eyes found mine. I could see him doing the calculation, understanding the timeline, grasping what I wasn't saying out loud, that I'd done my job entirely. That I'd flagged a catastrophic legal vulnerability and passed it along like a professional. That someone who was supposedly too detail-focused had actually saved Hudson Bay consultants from a potential disaster. You should have escalated this, Victor said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded thin and defensive. I did, I replied. Through proper channels. To you, through the shared documentation system. Last Friday. Callum was already pulling his phone, no doubt reviewing the email chain that would confirm everything I was saying. Victor knew it too. I could see him calculating the ramifications, how this was going to look to the chief financial officer, to the board, to everyone involved in post-acquisition reviews. We need to get legal on the phone, I said, slipping into pure professional mode. I can walk through the problematic sections and propose revision language. There's still time to fix this before signing if we move quickly. You're back on the project, Victor said immediately. Full authority over contract revisions. Work with legal directly. I could have smiled then. Could have let even a flicker of satisfaction cross my face. Instead, I just nodded and walked out to make the calls that would actually fix the problem. The calls that needed fixing in the first place by someone who paid attention to details that mattered. The revision process took 4 days. 4 intensely compressed days where I barely left the office, surviving on vending machine coffee and the sandwiches Simone kept bringing me from the cafe downstairs. Working alongside our legal team, specifically with Patricia Whitmore, the senior counsel who'd actually caught the liability issue, I systematically went through every potential exposure, rewrote the problematic clauses, and created safeguards that protected Hudson Bay's interests while remaining equitable to Meridian. Patricia was the kind of lawyer who understood that good legal work wasn't just about protecting against worst-case scenarios, it was about creating pathways that made both parties comfortable moving forward. She had this particular way of highlighting problematic language with actual yellow highlighters while simultaneously drafting replacement language on her laptop, working analog and digital simultaneously like she was covering all possible interpretive angles at once. The conference room became our headquarters. We spread documents across the massive oak table, the one that normally hosted quarterly board meetings, creating a paper landscape that tracked every revision, every consideration, every moment we'd pivoted toward a solution. There were 17 different versions of the indemnification clause alone. 17 attempts to find language that was precise enough to protect Hudson Bay but flexible enough that Meridian wouldn't feel cornered into defensive legal positions further down the line. It was intricate, demanding work that required exactly the kind of detail-focused thinking Victor had dismissed so casually. The kind of work that most people found tedious but that I'd always found oddly satisfying, like solving a puzzle where the pieces were made of language and consequence. Patricia pulled me aside on the 3rd day of revisions. We were in the legal conference room, surrounded by redlined copies of contracts, coffee cups in various stages of emptiness, and the kind of organized chaos that comes with serious work. The afternoon sun was hitting the glass walls at an angle that made everyone squint, and Patricia had actually brought her own desk lamp from her office because the overhead fluorescents were giving her a headache. This clause here, she said, pointing to a section I'd reworded. How did you know to structure it this way? It's elegant. It addresses the ambiguity but doesn't trigger Meridian's defensiveness. Most people would have just added more language. You simplified it. Because the problem wasn't too little clarity, I explained. It was structural. The original language tried to cover liability through addition, but what we actually needed was reorganization. Moving the trigger conditions earlier in the clause so both parties understand the threshold before costs are assessed. She nodded slowly, leaning back in her chair. You should have been leading this from the beginning. That wasn't the decision that was made, I said neutrally. But internally, I was storing that validation like a precious thing. Not because it proved Victor wrong, that was already obvious, but because it confirmed something I'd begun to doubt during those 48 hours of exile, that my instincts about how to solve problems were actually sound. That being detail-oriented wasn't a liability. It was a feature. It was exactly what this kind of work required. The signing happened the following Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I wasn't in the boardroom where the actual signatures went down. That was Victor's moment to be present and professional and take whatever credit he could gather, but I was in a smaller conference room nearby with Patricia and 2 members of our finance team, monitoring communications and ready to address any last-minute legal questions. Meridian's representatives actually commented during the closing about how thoughtfully the contract had been structured. How it anticipated edge cases without being adversarial. How they felt protected but not penalized. One of their senior negotiators, a woman named Charlene who'd been relatively quiet throughout most of the process, pulled me aside afterward in the hallway. Whoever rewrote those liability sections understands what they're doing, she said. This is good work. Professional. Fair. You don't see that often in deals this size. I accepted the compliment graciously, but what struck me most was how directly she attributed the quality to methodology rather than luck. She understood that the language wasn't accidentally elegant. It was intentionally constructed. But that wasn't actually the interesting part of the story. The partner meeting happened on Tuesday afternoon in what I later learned was a tense, uncomfortable session in the executive boardroom on the 15th floor. I wasn't in it, wasn't invited, wasn't needed for that particular conversation, but Simone was there because her boss attended, and she heard everything that went down. We grabbed coffee afterward at the place downstairs where they make actual espresso instead of the watered-down corporate blend from the office kitchen. They were brutal, Simone said, stirring in extra sugar into her latte even though she usually took it black. A sign that she was still processing what she'd witnessed. Victor tried to spin it like he'd caught the liability issue through his team's oversight. Called it proactive risk management. I raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Then Patricia stood up, Simone continued, and she literally had a folder. Like, an actual physical folder with the timeline printed out. Showed the date you flagged the issue. Showed Victor's initials acknowledging receipt. Showed the email chain where he reassigned you and brought in Callum instead. What did he say to that? I asked carefully. He tried to argue that the flag wasn't urgent enough to act on immediately. That you'd used cautious language. Something about how if it had been truly critical, you would have escalated differently. That actually made me laugh. I highlighted it in yellow. In a document titled Critical Items Requiring Attention. How much more escalated could I have made it? That's literally what Patricia asked, Simone said. And then the CFO started asking questions about why Victor hadn't acted on a $50 million exposure when it was presented to him. And whether this was part of a broader pattern of project management issues. She paused, taking a long drink of her latte. After that, Victor kept trying to defend himself, but the room had already shifted. You could see it. Everyone suddenly understood that this wasn't about a drafting error. It was about someone not listening when someone else was trying to prevent a disaster. What I heard later, through Simone, through office gossip, through the particular way information travels in organizations when something significant has shifted, was that the conversation had turned uncomfortable. The CEO had apparently asked why I'd been removed from the deal team in the first place. Victor's answer about big picture versus detail-focused thinking didn't land the way it had in my cubicle. In the boardroom, with millions on the line, it sounded like exactly what it was, a management decision based on ego rather than capability. 6 weeks later, restructuring was announced. The kind of structural reorganization that companies implement when they need to make changes without directly admitting that specific people failed. 3 positions were consolidated. The merger prep team was being expanded under new leadership. And Victor was being offered either a lateral move to regional accounts, a demotion disguised as a transition, or early retirement with a modest severance package. The regional accounts role meant smaller deals, less visibility, and essentially a professional step backward. Everyone understood that. Victor understood that. His choice came quickly, he took the retirement. 46 years old. 20 years at Hudson Bay. Essentially pushed out because he'd prioritized perception over performance. Because he'd made a judgment call based on ego and it had backfired. Because the system, given enough time, actually does eventually reward competence and punish incompetence, even if the journey to that outcome is uncomfortable to watch. I heard through the grapevine that he'd left on a Thursday. Cleaned out his office quietly. Didn't make a big announcement. Just vanished into whatever came next for people who'd held significant positions and then lost them through their own choices. I didn't feel vindicated exactly. That would imply that I'd been seeking vindication. What I felt was something closer to closure. The situation had resolved itself through natural consequences. My reputation had been restored not through my seeking it but through simply doing my job well enough that the truth became undeniable. And Victor had faced consequences for his poor judgment, consequences that had nothing to do with me taking action and everything to do with his own decisions playing out over time. What happened next was perhaps more interesting than Victor's departure. Because the company did something I hadn't entirely expected, they actually learned from the situation. The new deal oversight structure was built around something called collaborative expertise, which was corporate speak for "we're never again going to remove essential talent from critical projects because someone's ego got in the way." Patricia became the head of deal legal, which was a promotion she'd clearly deserved for years. Simone moved into a project coordination role that gave her actual authority instead of just title. And I was offered the director position overseeing deal compliance. The offer conversation with the new CEO happened in her office, still the same view of downtown, still the same uncomfortable chairs, but somehow the entire context had shifted. She was direct about what had occurred. "You were removed from a critical project by someone who made a judgment call based on personality rather than performance," she said. "That judgment call nearly cost us $50 million. We've learned from that mistake." "I appreciate the acknowledgement," I replied carefully. "The question is," she continued, "what do you want to do now? Because from where I'm sitting, you have options. You could move up here into a senior compliance role. You could transfer to another firm, and frankly, I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to. Or you could stay where you are and we could make sure it never happens again." I thought about that for a long moment. About what would motivate me going forward. About whether I could actually trust that a company's promises of cultural change would stick, or whether this was just the temporary remorse that follows a very public mistake. "I want the director role," I said finally. "But I want to rebuild the deal verification process from scratch. I want to institute checks that don't depend on any single person's judgment. I want systems that make it impossible for critical issues to slip through just because someone decides they're too minor or too detail-focused to matter." She smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The next 6 months were some of the most satisfying I'd spent at Hudson Bay. I completely rebuilt the contract review process. Implemented tiered verification systems where no single person could greenlight a problematic clause without multiple review stages. Created documentation protocols that made every flag and every decision transparent. Built redundancy into the system so that if someone got removed from a project, for any reason, their work wouldn't vanish with them. I brought in 2 new hires, both of them detail-oriented analysts who'd been previously overlooked in their own organizations for exactly the same reason Victor had dismissed me. I trained them not just on procedures but on competence, on how to trust their instincts about what matters, how to communicate concerns without being defensive, how to navigate the politics of organizations where competence doesn't always get immediately recognized. One of them was a woman named Claire who'd been told at her previous firm that she was too thorough for senior roles. The other was a man named Owen who'd been pushed into administrative work because someone had decided he didn't have the executive presence needed for advancement. Both of them were brilliant. Both of them had been underutilized because of someone's perception rather than their actual capability. Watching them gain confidence as we built something structured and fair, that was genuinely rewarding in a way that vindication alone never would have been. I ran into Victor once, about 8 months after he'd left. It was at a conference downtown, One of those industry events where people end up in the same elevator or at the same coffee station and have to choose between acknowledging each other or pretending the other person doesn't exist. He looked older. Not worse, just older. Like something had shifted in how he carried himself. "Dina," he said. "I heard about your promotion." "Thank you," I replied. "How are you doing?" "Consulting," he said. "Started my own firm. Smaller scale, but it's good. Actually reminds me why I enjoyed this work in the first place." We made small talk for a few more minutes. I didn't bring up what had happened. He didn't apologize. Neither of us needed to replay it. The situation had resolved itself, and now we were just two people who'd worked together once and didn't anymore. But as he was leaving, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "you were right to flag that Meridian issue. I should have listened better when you brought it up." It wasn't a formal apology. It was just an acknowledgement, delivered quietly, without fanfare. And somehow that was exactly what I needed to hear, not because it would change anything that had already happened, but because it meant he'd actually reflected on his choices instead of just moving on and blaming circumstances. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, and I meant it. The Meridian acquisition closed successfully. Hudson Bay expanded its market presence into 3 new regions. The deal became something of a case study in how well-structured partnerships can create value for both organizations. And somewhere in that success, my role had shifted from being overlooked to being acknowledged as fundamental. I got promoted again, 18 months after the director position. Senior Vice President of Deal Operations. Which is a title that probably doesn't mean much to anyone outside Hudson Bay, but internally it meant something significant, that I had authority. That my judgment mattered. That the company had actually internalized the lesson about not dismissing competence just because it came wrapped in characteristics that made some people uncomfortable. What's interesting is that I don't think any of that would have happened if Victor hadn't removed me from the Meridian project in the first place. If he'd left me in that role, I probably would have continued doing excellent work that nobody outside the immediate team would have noticed. I'd have been efficient and capable and completely invisible to anyone making promotion decisions. It took being benched, it took being dismissed and then proven right in the most public way possible, for the organization to actually see what I was capable of. If you've ever been dismissed or underestimated at work, if you've had your value questioned by someone more politically skilled but less competent, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell me about the moment you realized that your assessment of a situation was more accurate than the assessment of someone with more authority. Tell me how you handled it, whether you stayed at that organization or moved on, what you learned from being temporarily invisible. These stories matter because they remind us that we're not alone in navigating workplaces where perception doesn't always align with reality. Where sometimes the people with the most confidence have the least actual competence. Where being detail-oriented can feel like a liability until suddenly it's the thing that saves everything. And if you're watching this thinking about your own situation right now, about someone who's written you off or underestimated your contributions, about a moment where you felt dismissed and unseen, here's what I want you to remember: your value doesn't disappear just because someone fails to recognize it. Your judgment doesn't become wrong because someone questions it. Your competence isn't diminished by someone's poor assessment of it. Keep doing your work. Keep documenting it. Keep being professional. Keep flagging the problems that need attention, even when you're not sure anyone will listen. The reckoning will come on its own timeline, and you'll still be standing when it does. You'll probably be standing taller than the person who underestimated you, and you won't even have had to lift a finger to make that happen. The system works. It just works slowly sometimes. Subscribe if this resonated with you. Like if you've ever been the person in the room who was paying attention to details everyone else missed. And comment with your story, because those are what make this real.